much cattle. Finally, an examination of the non-sacrificial laws about the treatment of animals provides various examples of compassion. For example, the prohibition on yoking together an ox and an ass, presumably because the differences between the pair might cause difficulties for the weaker of the two. And the prohibition on slaughtering mother cattle with their young on the same day, and the requirement to help one's donkey or the animal of another to stand when it has fallen under a heavy load. Taken together with similar cases, the rabbinic principle is generated of tza'ah ba'alei chayim, literally pain of a living being, which phrase is not in the Bible, but is a Talmudic expression of the biblically imposed duty to relieve the suffering of all living beings. If this is the background for how non-human animals are viewed, how are we to take the prescriptions for animal sacrifice? In speaking to this question, I will use two ideas from my own previous work. I mentioned them at the beginning of this paper, namely, the moral gap, or what I'm going to call in this paper the holiness gap, and the idea of evaluative transfer. The moral gap is the gap between God's moral demand of us and our natural capacities to comply with that demand. By natural capacities, I mean the capacities we are born with and naturally develop. My claim has been that the demand is too high for us by our natural capacities, and that it is incoherent to hold ourselves to a standard we are not able to meet. The principle here is that ought implies can, which should be understood as holding that if it is not the case that we can, then the question of whether we ought does not properly arise. For the present topic, I need to widen the discussion to include both moral offenses and offenses against ritual purity. God sets up the standard as holiness. Be ye holy, even as I am holy. Though this has to be understood without the implication that we are actually to become God. The gap structure has three parts to it. There is the demand, and our inadequate capacities and performance, and then there is the being that is seen as the source of the demand. It is interesting that in Western moral philosophy, this structure is seen in Immanuel Kant, who says throughout his corpus that we have to recognize our duties as God's commands, and in many post-Kantian secular systems, where the third part of the structure is named as the point of view of the universe, or an impartial observer, or the archangel, or persons behind the veil of ignorance. Within Christianity, the story is that the third part of the structure, the holy being, intervenes to change the second part of the structure, our capacities and performance, so that they become adequate to the first part of the structure, namely the demand. I want to suggest that this story also lies behind the sacrificial system in the Hebrew Scriptures, and indeed, that is where Christianity got it. The other idea I want to mention is that of evaluative transfer. Again, I will start with Kant, who objects to penal substitutionary accounts of atonement, that guilt is not a transmissible liability that could be transferred like a financial debt from one person to another. I think he's wrong about this, and I have argued this in more detail elsewhere. He is objecting to Christian accounts of the death of Christ as taking the penalty for our sin. But the same objection could be made about accounts of atoning animal sacrifice in terms of penal substitution. I want to distinguish in what follows between the scapegoat, which is not really a sacrifice at all, and sacrifices proper, where these involve the direct killing of an animal. But it is certainly hard to see how one could transfer sins onto a goat. I want to defend the idea that with shame, of which I take guilt for sin to be one part, it is intelligible that one person could be ashamed of what another person has done. This is what I call evaluative transfer, and it is made possible by certain kinds of identification or partial mergers of identity. A spouse can be proud of what his spouse has done, or a mother of what her child has done. I lived this past year in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and observed how, when Michigan State was in the national basketball quarterfinals, having beaten two teams expected to win, the governor and even our Presbyterian minister, who never talked about sports in church, said that in this time of economic difficulty, we had all been made proud and lifted up by their victory. While this kind of identification is not always healthy and can indeed be pathological, I think that the possibility of this kind of evaluative transfer lies within most of the relationships that make life worth living. The transfer works because the individuals involved are parts of a larger whole, for example, a family or a state. I'm going to suggest that the fact that the animal is seen as part of the household of the person offering the atoning sacrifice is a key to making the sacrifice intelligible in the context in which such sacrifices were offered. I will now describe very briefly a few different models for what's going on in animal sacrifices and sacrificial offerings, and I will end up focusing on three of them. It's possible for a single practice to have multiple levels of meaning, or to be multivalent. And sacrifices already form a group of practices, many of them not concerned with atonement at all. On the other hand, some of these models are inconsistent with each other and are articulated as such. I'm going to give preference to models that aim to capture the self-understanding of those who engaged in the practice. Capturing this is very difficult because the texts, while describing the practice in some detail, though still with notable gaps, say very little about why people are to do the things that are prescribed. But I mean to lay aside models that say that whatever the practitioners may have thought they were doing, they were in fact doing something quite different. I'm not denying that there is self-deception and bad faith in much social practice, but the task of exposing it needs to come after the slow and patient unfolding of what the participants, in this case especially the priests, take themselves to be doing. Even if this were not true generally, it would be true for the conduct of this conference, where the self-understanding revealed in these texts is exactly what we're supposed to be looking at. So I'm laying aside the theory of sacrifice in which humans participate by eating the animal as a totem, representing both the god and the tribe, and also the theory of sacrifice as a non-conscious channel or shunt of violence. By contrast with these models are three models of sacrifice that attempt to understand the system in its own terms. So I omitted a section. Sacrifice is, first, an imitation of God. Second, an attempt to attract and maintain the presence of God. And third, an expiation of ritual impurity and sin. I will spend most time on the last of these, but I want to say something about the first two first. The first model is that in the preparation for and the act of sacrifice, human beings become more like God. God tells us we are to become more like God, though we do not actually become God. The central text of the entire holiness code is, "Be ye holy as I am holy." This command presents us with a problem, however, what I called at the beginning a holiness gap between us and God. In Leviticus, there are especially two kinds of things that separate human beings from God: ritual impurity and sin. Ritual impurity occurs through natural processes and substances, such as birth, death, bodily flows, certain animal carcasses, and human corpses. The effect is temporary, contagious defilement of persons and objects, and the resolution is ritual purification, including sacrifices, but also, for example, washing. Sin also contaminates, especially idolatry, sexual transgressions, and bloodshed. The effect here is long-lasting contamination of sinners, land, and sanctuary, and the resolution is atonement or punishment and ultimately exile.